The florist, who had settled down to ply his trade opposite the senior Conservative club, was a delightful fellow, thoroughly sound on the hollyhock question, and so informative in the matter of delphiniums, achilleas, coreopsis, eriniums, geums, lupines, bergamot, and early phloxes, that Lord Emsworth gave himself up wholeheartedly to the feast of reason and the flow of soul. And it was only some 15 minutes later that he remembered that he had left a guest languishing in the lower smoking-room, and that this guest might be thinking him a trifle remiss in the observance of the sacred duties of hospitality. "Bless my soul, yes," said his lordship, coming out from under the influence with a start. Even then he could not bring himself to dash abruptly from the shop. Twice he reached the door, and twice pottered back to sniff at flowers, say something he had forgotten to mention about the stronger growing clematis. Finally, however, with one last longing, lingering look behind, he tore himself away and trotted back across the road. Arrived in the lower smoking-room, he stood in the doorway for a moment, peering. The place had been a blur to him when he had left it, but he remembered that he had been sitting in the middle window, and as there were only 2 seats by the window, that tall, dark young man in one of them must be the guest he had deserted. That he could be a changeling never occurred to Lord Emsworth. So pleasantly had the time passed in the shop across the way that he had the impression that he had only been gone a couple of minutes or so. He made his way to where the young man sat. A vague idea came into his head that the other had grown a bit in his absence, but it passed. "My dear fellow," he said genially, as he slid into the other chair, "I really must apologize." It was plain to Smith that the other was under a misapprehension, and was a really nice-minded young man. He would no doubt have put the matter right at once. The fact that it never for a single instant occurred to Smith to do so was due, no doubt, to some innate defect in his character. He was essentially a young man who took life as it came, and the more inconsequentially it came, the better he liked it. Presently, he reflected, it would become necessary for him to make some excuse, and steal quietly out of the other's life. But meanwhile, the situation seemed to him to present entertaining possibilities. "Not at all," he replied graciously. "Not at all." "I was afraid for a moment," said Lord Emsworth, "that you might quite naturally be offended." "Absurd." "I shouldn't have left you like that. Shocking bad manners, but, my dear fellow, I simply had to pop across the street." "Most decidedly," said Smith. "Always pop across streets. It is the secret of a happy and successful life." Lord Emsworth looked at him a little perplexedly, and wondered if he had caught the last remark correctly. But his mind had never been designed for the purpose of dwelling closely on problems for any length of time, and he let it go. "Beautiful roses that man has," he observed. "Really an extraordinarily fine display." "Indeed," said Smith. "Nothing to touch mine, though. I wish, my dear fellow, you could have been down at Blandings at the beginning of the month. My roses were at their best then. It's too bad you weren't there to see them." "The fault, no doubt, was mine," said Smith. "Of course, you weren't in England then." "Ah, that explains it." "Still, I shall have plenty of flowers to show you when you are at Blandings, I expect," said Lord Emsworth, at last showing a host-like disposition to give his guest a belated innings. "I expect you'll write one of your poems about my gardens, eh?" Smith was conscious of a feeling of distinct gratification. Weeks of toil among the herrings of Billingsgate had left him with a sort of haunting fear that even in private life there clung to him the miasma of the fish market. Yet here was a perfectly unprejudiced observer looking squarely at him and mistaking him for a poet, showing that in spite of all he had gone through, there must still be something notably spiritual and unfishy about his outward appearance. Very possibly, he said. I suppose you get your ideas for poetry from all sorts of things, said Lord Emsworth, nobly resisting the temptation to collar the conversation again. He was feeling extremely friendly towards this poet fellow. He was deuced civil of him. It was no deuced civil of him not to be put out and huffy at being left alone in the smoking room. From practically everything, said Smith, except fish. Fish? I have never written a poem about fish. No, said Lord Emsworth, again feeling that a pin had worked loose in the machinery of the conversation. I was once offered a princely sum, went on Smith, now floating happily along on the tide of his native exuberance, to write a ballad for the Fishmonger's Gazette entitled Herbert the Turbot. But I was firm. I declined. Indeed, said Lord Emsworth. One has one's self-respect, said Smith. Oh, decidedly, said Lord Emsworth. It was painful, of course. The editor broke down completely when he realised that my refusal was final. However, I sent him on with a letter of introduction to John Drinkwater, who, I believe, turned him out quite a good little effort on the theme. At this moment, when Lord Emsworth was feeling a trifle dizzy, and Smith, on whom conversation always acted as a mental stimulus, was on the point of plunging ever deeper into the agreeable depths of light persiflage, a waiter approached. A lady to see you, your lordship. Yes, of course. I was expecting her. It is a Miss, what's the name? Halliday. Halliday? It is Miss Halliday, he said in explanation to Smith, who is coming down to Blandings to catalogue the library. My secretary, Baxter, told her to call here and see me. If you'll excuse me for a moment, my dear fellow. Certainly. As Lord Emsworth disappeared, it occurred to Smith that the moment had arrived for him to get his hat and steal softly out of the other's life for ever. Only so could confusion and embarrassing explanations be avoided. And it was Smith's guiding rule in life always to avoid explanations. It might, he felt, cause Lord Emsworth a momentary pang when he returned to the smoking room and found that he was a poet short. But what is that in these modern days, when poets are so plentiful that it's almost impossible to fling a brick in any public place without damaging some stern young singer? Smith's view of the matter was that if Lord Emsworth was bent on associating with poets, there was bound to be another one along in a minute. He was on the point, therefore, of rising, when the laziness induced by a good lunch decided him to remain in his comfortable chair for a few minutes longer. He was in one of those moods of rare tranquillity which it is rash to break. He lit another cigarette, and his thoughts, as they had done after the departure of Mr. McTodd, turned dreamily in the direction of the girl he had met at Miss Clarkson's employment bureau. He mused upon her with a gentle melancholy. Sad, he felt, that two obviously kindred spirits like himself and her should meet in the whirl of London life, only to separate again, presumably forever, simply because the etiquette governing those who are created male and female forbids a man to cement a chance acquaintanceship by ascertaining the lady's name and address, asking her to lunch, and swearing eternal friendship. He sighed as he gazed thoughtfully out of the lower smoking-room window. As he had indicated in his conversation with Mr. Waldwick, those blue eyes and that cheerful, friendly face had made a deep impression on him. Who was she? Where did she live? And was he ever to see her again? He was. Even as he asked himself the question, two figures came down the steps of the club and paused. One was Lord Emsworth without his hat, the other... And Smith's usually orderly heart gave a spasmodic bound at the sight of her. was the very girl who was occupying his thoughts. There she stood, as blue-eyed, as fair-haired, as indescribably jolly and charming as ever. Smith rose from his chair with a vehemence almost equal to that recently displayed by Mr. McTodd. It was his intention to add himself immediately to the group. He raced across the room in a manner that drew censorious glances from the local greybeards, many of whom had half a mind to write to the committee about it. But when he reached the open air, the pavement at the foot of the club steps was empty. The girl was just vanishing round the corner into the Strand, and of Lord Emsworth there was no sign whatever. By this time, however, Smith had acquired a useful working knowledge of his lordship's habits, and he knew where to look. He crossed the street and headed for the florist's shop. "Ah, my dear fellow," said his lordship amiably, suspending his conversation with the proprietor on the subject of delphiniums. "Must you be off? Oh, don't forget that our train leaves Paddington at 5 sharp. You take your ticket for Market Blandings." Smith had come into the shop merely with the intention of asking his lordship if he happened to know Miss Halliday's address. But these words opened out such a vista of attractive possibilities that he had abandoned this tame programme immediately. He remembered now that among Mr. McTodd's remarks on things in general had been one to the effect that he had received an invitation to visit Blandings Castle, of which invitation he did not propose to avail himself. And he argued that if he had acted as substitute for Mr. McTodd at the club, he might well continue the kindly work of officiating for him at Blandings. Looking at the matter altruistically, he'd prevent his kind host much disappointment by taking this course. And looking at it from a more personal viewpoint, only by going to Blandings could he renew his acquaintance with this girl. Smith had never been one of those who hang back diffidently when adventure calls, and he did not hang back now. 5 sharp, he said. I will be there. Capital, my dear fellow, said his lordship. Does Miss Halliday travel with us? Oh, no, she's coming down in a day or two. I shall look forward to meeting her, said Smith. He turned to the door, and Lord Emsworth, with a farewell beam, resumed his conversation with the florist. The 5 o'clock train, having given itself a spasmodic jerk, began to move slowly out of the Paddington station. The platform past which it was gliding was crowded with the number of fauna always to be seen at railway stations at such moments. But in their ranks there was no sign of Mr. Ralston McTodd, and Smith, as he sat opposite Lord Emsworth in a corner seat of a first-class compartment, felt that genial glow of satisfaction which comes to the man who has successfully taken a chance. Until now he had been half afraid that Mr. McTodd, having changed his mind, might suddenly appear with bag and baggage, an event which must necessarily have caused confusion and discomfort. His mind was now tranquil. Concerning the future, he declined to worry. It would, no doubt, contain its little difficulties, but he was prepared to meet them in the right spirit, and his only trouble in the world now was the difficulty he was experiencing in avoiding his lordship's legs, which showed a disposition to pervade the compartment like the tentacles of an octopus. Lord Emsworth rather ran to leg, and his practice of reclining when at ease on the base of his spine was causing him to straddle, like Apollyon in Pilgrim's Progress, right across the way. It became manifest that in a journey lasting several hours, his society was likely to prove irksome. For the time being, however, he endured it, and listened with polite attention to his host's remarks on the subject of the Blandings garden. Lord Emsworth, in a train moving in the direction of home, was behaving like a horse heading for his stable. He snorted eagerly, and spoke at length and with emotion of roses and herbaceous borders. "It will be dark, I suppose, by the time we arrive," he said regretfully. But the first thing tomorrow, my dear fellow, I must take you round and show you my gardens." "I shall look forward to it keenly," said Smith. "They are, I can readily imagine, distinctly ujar cum spiff." "I beg your pardon?" said Lord Emsworth with a start. "Not at all," said Smith graciously. What did you say?" asked his lordship after a slight pause. "I was saying that from all reports you must have a very nifty display of garden produce at your rural seat." "Oh, yes, oh, most," said his lordship, looking puzzled. He examined Smith across the compartment with something of the peering curiosity which he would have bestowed upon a new and unclassified shrub. "Most extraordinary," he murmured. "I trust, my dear fellow, you'll not think me personal, but you know, nobody would imagine that you were a poet. You don't look like a poet, and dash it, you don't talk like a poet." "How should a poet talk?" "Well," Lord Emsworth considered the point. "Well, Miss Peavy, but of course you don't know Miss Peavy. Miss Peavy is a poetess, and she waylaid me the other morning while I was having a most important conference with McAllister on the subject of bulbs, and asked me if I didn't think that it was fairies' teardrops that made the dew. Did you ever hear such dashed nonsense?" "Evidently an aggravated case. Is Miss Peavy staying at the castle?" "My dear fellow, you couldn't shift her with blasting powder. Really, this craze of my sister Constance for filling the house with these infernal literary people is getting on my nerves. I can't stand these poets and what not. I never could." "We must always remember, however," said Smith gravely, "that poets are also God's creatures." "Good heavens!" exclaimed his lordship aghast. "I'd forgotten that you were one. What will you think of me, my dear fellow? But of course, as I said a moment ago, you are different. I admit that when Constance told me that she had invited you to the house, I was not cheered. But now that I have had the pleasure of meeting you—" And the conversation had worked round to the very point to which Smith had been wishing to direct it. He was keenly desirous of finding out why Mr. McTodd had been invited to Blandings, and, a still more vital matter, of ascertaining whether on his arrival there as Mr. McTodd's understudy he was going to meet people who knew the poet by sight. On this latter point, it seemed to him, hung the question of whether he was about to enjoy a delightful visit to a historic country house in the society of Eve Halliday, or leave the train at the next stop and omit to return to it. "It was extremely kind of Lady Constance," he hazarded, "to invite a perfect stranger to Blandings." "Oh, she's always doing that sort of thing," said his lordship. "It didn't matter to her that she'd never seen you in her life. She'd read your books, you know, and liked them, and when she heard that you were coming to England, she wrote to you." "I see," said Smith, relieved. "Of course, it is all right, as it has turned out," said Lord Emsworth handsomely. "As I say, you're different, and how you came to write that—" "Bilge?" asked Smith. "The very word I was about to employ, my dear fellow. No, I don't mean that. Capital stuff, no doubt, capital stuff, but—" "I understand." "Constance tried to make me read the things, but I couldn't. I fell asleep over them." "I hope you rested well." The fact is, I suppose they were beyond me. I couldn't see any sense in the things." "If you would care to have another pop at them," said Smith, agreeably, "I have a complete set in my bag." No, my dear fellow, thank you very, very much. Thank you 1,000 times. I find that reading in the train tries my eyes." "Ah, you'd prefer that I read them aloud?" No. A look of hunted alarm came into his lordship's speaking countenance at the suggestion. "As a matter of fact, I generally take a short nap at the beginning of a railway journey. I find it refreshing and, in short, refreshing. You'll excuse me?" "If you think you can get to sleep all right without the aid of my poems, then certainly." "You won't think me rude?" "Oh, not at all, not at all. By the way, am I likely to meet any old friends at Blandings?" Oh, no, there'll be nobody but ourselves, except my sister and Miss Peavy, of course." You said you had not met Miss Peavy, I think? I have not had that pleasure. I am, of course, looking forward to it with the utmost keenness. Lord Emsworth eyed him for a moment, astonished, then concluded the conversation by closing his eyes defensively. Smith was left to his reflections, which a few minutes later were interrupted by a smart kick on the shin as Lord Emsworth, a jumpy sleeper, began to throw his long legs about. Smith moved to the other end of the seat, and taking his bag down from the rack, extracted a slim volume bound in squashy mauve. After gazing at this in an unfriendly manner for a moment, he opened it at random and began to read. His first move on leaving Lord Emsworth at the florist's had been to spend a portion of his slender capital on the works of Ralston MacTodd, in order not to be taken at a disadvantage in the event of questions about them at Blandings. But he speedily realized, as he dipped into the poems, that anything in the nature of a prolonged study of them was likely to spoil his little holiday. They were not summer reading. Across the pale parabola of joy. A gurgling snort from the other end of the compartment abruptly detached his mind from its struggle with this mystic line. He perceived that his host had slipped even further down onto his spine and was now lying with open mouth in an attitude suggestive of dislocation. And as he looked, there was a whistling sound, and another snore proceeded from the back of his lordship's throat. Smith rose and took his book of poems out into the corridor with the purpose of roaming along the train until he should find an empty compartment in which to read in peace. With the two adjoining compartments he had no luck. One was occupied by an elderly man with a retriever, while the presence of a baby in the other ruled it out of consideration. The third, however, looked more promising. It was not actually empty, but there was only one occupant, and he was asleep. He was lying back in the far corner with a large silk handkerchief draped over his face and his feet propped up on the seat opposite. His society did not seem likely to act as a bar to the study of Mr. MacTodd's masterpieces. Smith sat down and resumed his reading. Across the pale parabola of joy. Smith knitted his brow. He was just the sort of line which was likely to have puzzled his patroness, Lady Constance, and he anticipated that she would come to him directly he arrived and ask for an explanation. It would obviously be a poor start for his visit to confess that he had no theory as to its meaning himself. He tried it again. Across the pale parabola of joy. A sound like 2 or 3 pigs feeding rather noisily in the middle of a thunderstorm interrupted his meditations. Smith laid his book down and gazed in a pained way across the compartment. There came upon him a sense of being unfairly put upon, as towards the end of his troubles it might have come upon Job. This he felt was too much. He was being harried. The man in the corner went on snoring. There is always a way. Almost immediately, Smith saw what Napoleon would have done in this crisis. On the seat beside the sleeper was lying a compact little suitcase with hard, sharp edges. Rising softly, Smith edged along the compartment and secured this. Then, having balanced it carefully on the rack above the sleeper's stomach, he returned to his seat to await developments. These were not long in coming. The train, now flying at its best speed through open country, was shaking itself at intervals in a vigorous way as it raced along. A few seconds later it apparently passed over some points, shivered briskly down its whole length. The suitcase wobbled insecurely, hesitated, and then fell chunkily in the exact middle of its owner's waistcoat. There was a smothered gulp beneath the handkerchief. The sleeper sat up with a jerk. The handkerchief fell off, and there was revealed to Smith's interested gaze the face of the on Freddie Threepwood,